Fuck flying enemies. Hello. Annoying buggers, all of them. Darting around, denying the ground while I have to accept it. Naturally, when I saw a game on Steam all about flying enemies and aerial 2D brawling, I immediately bought it. Consider it exposure therapy. And, well, it's pretty fucking fun. That text crawl back there is your story. One of the two Wilder brothers has bought the loyalty of every ninja in town so he can easily win a fighting circuit. The prize being ownership of the city, which has been in the Wilder hands for years, which he will then sell off. The other Wilder heir is a bit less business-minded, and in his way. So, we have the ability to fly and several hundred corrupt ninjas in our way. You don't really need much story beyond that, it kinda writes itself. But if you do want it summed up, it's one man fighting through a city of ninjas, occasionally stopping to also beat up their dogs, who presumably have also been bought off. Let's start with the controls. Ace's Wild is really easy to pick up and bloody tricky to master. No combos to memorise, and the three characters you can play as all handle identically, just with some differing quirks. Also, this game supports controllers, and yeah, if you can use one, it's just far easier. A light combo button, a button for heavy and charge attacks, a jump, a dash, a dodge counter, and lastly the panic button. That's all you've got to remember. You've got a good range of movement, navigation is nice and easy, a sense of weight without feeling either slippery or heavy. You see, the thing is, you're not so much a human, you're more like a VTOL with fists. Like I said, this game is all about flying enemies, and you're no slouch either. The most useful thing the ground offers you is something to bounce people off of. You can jump infinitely, albeit on a pretty big delay. Getting an enemy into a rapid combo allows you to use them to fly around the map, blocking projectiles and dragging more poor sods into your whirlwind of death. The dash works in any direction and can be spammed to keep you airborne pretty much indefinitely, and the dodge lets you move through attacks or along streams of projectiles to maintain air. Keeping off the ground is easy enough that you don't have to think about it, but I perhaps overstated when I said you can fly. Some effort to remain on the offensive is required so you don't drop. Whether that means using your dash, heading towards attacks to dodge them and quickly gain back a jump, or laying into enemies to use them as a springboard. This makes just moving around in fights incredibly fun to watch and satisfying to do. This is how you make flying enemies fun. You make it so that you're capable of playing their game. The feeling of weight in the movement carries over to landing hits, satisfying sound effects, particle effects and animations, alongside the fact that light combos and heavy attacks end in enemies get sent fucking barreling across the room, smashing right into walls, flying into hazards, and crashing into each other. Yeah, you can send enemies down bottomless pits in this game, and you too can die from falling into a bottomless pit. In a game about near-flying ninjas, that's a pretty ignoble way to go. The fact that enemies are routinely sent flying even by a light combo creates an interesting and enjoyable dynamic. Part of the challenge in this game is keeping up a constant offensive, chasing down enemies before they can regain their composure and get back to attacking you. And it really doesn't hurt that this game is just fun to watch. When you effortlessly dodge enemy attacks, pummel whole groups and send them crashing into walls and each other, it just looks bloody brilliant. It's got a speed and fluidity that the controls near perfectly keep up with. I did find myself flailing at the air occasionally, because losing track of yourself is a bit of a risk when this much can go on. But once you get into a flow in this game, it's downright hypnotic. You play at your best in a muscle memory trance, and then you start thinking and fuck everything up. We got 3 blokes to choose from: Ace Wilder, Gene Drift, and Eagle Morris. Each name so uniquely stupid it took me a while to memorise them. In gameplay terms they have some mild differences, mainly to do with the range of their attacks and their speed. Ace Wilder is the middle ground, hits incredibly quick, and you can generally gauge how far his hits are. Gene Drift is a relative easy mode, hits very slightly less fast than incredibly quick, and due to lugging a big fuck-off sword, his range more than makes up for the minuscule loss of agility. Eagle Morris is slightly faster, and his hit range is awkwardly small. Combine that with him looking like the standard ninja enemies, in a game about very fast-paced crowd combat, and I just plain don't like playing as him all that much. Plus his dodge is much harder to gauge than the other characters, being a brief puff out of existence. All the characters are so fast anyway that the minor variances in their combos don't really add up to much, so Gene is pretty much the best character. Gene is also a boss fight later in the game. This is not changed should you play as him, nor does Gene seemingly give a shit, not even referencing it in his ending. All that matters is, at some point he kicks the shit out of himself. Meanwhile, the game does its damnedest to kick the shit out of you. Ace's Wild hits the ground running. Within a split second of the opening stage, enemies are flying straight at you. I hope you played your tutorial, because the opening question is, do you know how to dodge? This sets the tone pretty well. It's out for blood and it isn't going to pretend otherwise. Stages are broken up into rooms, each room being several waves of enemies who either spawn in sequence or await your arrival. You've got infinite lives, each room is a checkpoint, and from the moment you launch the game you can start in any level and in any room you want. Basically on death you never lose too much progress, and you can practice any room you want at any time or play them all in sequence. Death does carry a hefty score penalty, however. At first I noticed I could take quite a number of hits and my health bar wasn't all that bad for it. I mistook that for the game being actually pretty forgiving. Then I realised that was just mercy because the enemies are out for blood and in great numbers. Besides that, this game wants you to play at its pace, and this game is fast. The simple controls are there because the real difficulty isn't memorising your moves, it's more about learning how enemies telegraph their attacks and how to manage different crowds and setups of enemies, while herding them with your own attacks. The first couple of stages aren't that difficult either, definitely tricky, but that's just there to ease you in. Then it gets harder and harder. It took me about 7 or 8 hours before I considered myself somewhat competent at the game. One boss alone nearly took me 20 attempts before I eked out a win, and there are still a couple of rooms in the game that I haven't actually beaten. The only reason I've beaten the final boss is that you can select him right from the get-go. It can be frustrating at times, but how enjoyable it is kept me trying, and it did feel like a payoff when I started winning a lot more consistently. Also, I realised way too late, I'm actually on Sassy difficulty, 3 steps down from Maximus. So, I can't even beat the first boss on Maximus. I'll grant that increasing the difficulty does just increase enemy health and damage, and this may just be conjecture because I was getting the shit kicked out of me more easily, but I believe they're also more aggressive. Enemy setups and patterns did not seemingly change. There is a decent enemy variety. We've got ninjas who act a bit more like ninjas, big fuck-off army blokes, giant fuck-off fuckers who try and hit you with a giant slab, giant sword women, flying drones, and dogs. Each enemy has 2 or 3 attacks and various forms that differ in health and aggression. The game also does a good job mixing and matching enemies to create varied encounters. Some enemies have bloody incredible sync, and by that I mean that learning to fight them can be incredibly fucking annoying as they keep you pinned down forever while you look for an opening. It feels downright experimental what enemies are chucked at you at times, and sometimes it's pretty clear that Tyler Dokes, the creator of this, is just taking the piss. I mean, holy fuck, calm down. Yeah, in a room like this, if you're hit first, you are pretty much dead. Recovery is something you are lacking in this game. The moment you're hit by anything, you are sent flying. It's not too terrible, but depending on how enemies are set up around you, you could take a lot of damage from one singular fuck-up. The recovery time isn't terrible, it just comes down to circumstance, and you can try and dodge out of it, but it's only if you're dodging at the very last moment of being sent flying. The swordwomen are possibly the hardest enemy to learn because their attacks are slower than you'd actually think looking at them. They were the first enemy that gave me any incredible amount of trouble, and it became very satisfying once I figured out how to beat them back. Learning how enemies telegraph attacks is paramount. The game is well considered enough to introduce enemy types individually before putting them alongside others, so you get some time to practice your dodges. Getting the timing down on some of them is incredibly tricky, but very satisfying once you've got them down. And even then, dodge timing can be incredibly strict. Even as I got pretty good at dodging attacks, I still don't feel I've got a completely solid grasp on the timing. It doesn't trigger the instant you hit the button, so you've always got to dodge a bit earlier than you think. I think. There's also chain dodging, and it is vital when being attacked by swarms. When you're mid-dodge, if you dodge into another attack, you can chain dodges as long as there's someone trying to smack you. So it's important to dodge towards enemies. However, if you dodge into nothing, there is a delay before you can attempt another dodge. And most of the time this is an issue, and it's a way to make sure you can't remain invincible at all times. However, considering the sheer number of attackers, this also means that if one enemy is a split second late, you are going to get hit. No recourse. It does lead to some cheap damage, and this is also compounded by the fact that while for the most part this game is well animated, several moves have completely different timings, and they have the exact same setup, making some dodges a toss of the dice. I also wish maneuvering was just a bit more important in this game. It can be used to get around some attacks, but even then dodging is more beneficial. But several attacks also lock enemies to you and render moving out of the way pointless. How open-ended your movement is can feel a little pointless at times, and your dash is used purely for keeping pressure on enemies rather than dodging attacks, outside of one fight in the game. In every other case, you're better just chain dodging through enemies rather than repositioning. Despite this, the use of environment is actually well handled. I would duck behind obstacles to buy a moment to think, punch breakable parts of the environment to send them flying at enemies, and carry enemies to confined spaces in the area so it was easier to catch them when they were sent flying. The decent enemy variety, their mixing and matching, and the use of the environment keeps the fights interesting throughout. There isn't a dull moment. And occasionally a horde of ninjas will explode from whoever you just kicked the shit out of. The number of people afflicted by this bizarre phenomenon is tied to your combo score, so more points lead to more points. This is a completely random element in a game about racking up a high score, but I can't claim to care that much about it. You can tell ahead of time when this will happen, so don't knock out the guy who has reinforcements within while everyone else is knocking about. Despite my earlier complaints about dodging, getting hit by bullshit is by far and away in the minority. Most deaths felt like honest fuck-ups rather than the game killing me unfairly. There is one feature I've yet to go over, the wild bar. It's one of the more interesting cases of risk and reward I've seen in an otherwise simple brawler. There are no health pickups for a start. Once you cross the panic threshold, you can use it to do a burst and recover health. This empties the bar and sets the threshold further back for another burst until you either die or clear the stage. So far so simple. Well, the fuller the bar, the more damage increases both ways, and the enemies become more aggressive. So recovering health means putting yourself at greater risk. This risk increases each time you need to use the bar thereafter. Not just that, but the amount healed increases depending on how full the bar is. So do you hold out for more or cash in on that health now? Panic also kills your combo multiplier, so you're kissing goodbye to your score, alongside the fact that you're killing and getting killed slower, so you're losing time as well. Wild also acts as a charge for your, well, charge attacks. And while you can dash on an empty meter, it does drain Wild as well, encouraging dodging further. This leads to a pretty interesting balancing act. You can keep up consistently good damage but at greater risk to yourself, spam heavy to keep the bar reasonably filled, or cash in on a full bar for one incredibly powerful attack. All that, and you've got to manage the bar well enough to hold enough charge for a health refill. Each stage ends with a boss, and all but one of them is at the least enjoyable. Fuck Fancy Beast. Inventive movesets that are typically telegraphed well, and each of them are fun concepts that play to the game's strengths. Each of them ramp up in difficulty as well. Some just plain speed up, eventually to a truly ludicrous degree, others change the stage or get their siblings killed as well. Each is a good test of memorization and reflexes. It is to the game's credit that the combat is enjoyable both when up against crowds of enemies or against one singular tough opponent. The bosses represent the most enjoyable part of the game's combat, but they also make some of the more annoying design elements all the more noticeable. Quite a few enemies have 2 health bars, a recharging shield and their normal health. While shielded, enemies do not flinch from hits and they can attack uninterrupted. This alone isn't a problem. What is a problem is that I think this shield must be covered in soap. You become so floaty when you attempt to hit them, and they don't get locked in like regular unshielded buggers, so you have to make a concerted effort to stay on top of them, and it's really fidgety to do so. This is part of the reason I hate Fancy Beast. He always counts as shielded. He regularly fires machine gun wielding drones that also count as shielded, before locking off half the arena and doing it more often. This is the greasiest fucking robot going, and I'm not a fan. More annoyingly, enemies can no-sell any of your attacks whenever they want. You can never truly pin an enemy down no matter how skilled you are. They can escape whenever they want, at random. They may just decide they don't feel like getting pummeled and they go on their merry way. Usually this isn't so bad, but they can do it on any attack, including ones where you've used all of your meter. You could have landed a completely legitimate attack, but nah, don't feel up to it, it's a mite annoying. Further on the random front, enemies don't have a set pattern, including bosses. A lot of the difficulty really comes down to which attacks they feel like spamming. Again, Fancy Beast may just spend 5 minutes sat behind his fancy electric drones, spamming drones, rockets and machine gun fire. How dare the fucker use intelligence. Alongside this, quite a few of the more powerful attacks and combos are instant, no tells whatsoever. I like to think I've got good reflexes, but I can't compete against the computer saying fuck you. I love the fight against Gene Drift, or at least the first 2 stages of it. It's an incredibly fun, incredibly tricky fight that eventually requires inhuman reflexes. Then he just starts no-selling attacks every 2 seconds, And here is where the real fun starts. He has 2 counters when he no-sells your attacks. He either does an instant counter, so you have to dodge right away, or he jumps up for a drop attack. And because of dodge delay, if you bet on an instant, you will get hit. So every time he no-sells an attack, you're tossing a coin. Yeah, I have just spent an entire paragraph complaining about 1 second of gameplay that is happening repeatedly in one room. The charge attack is my last complaint. It works fine generally. During a charge, your speed up and control becomes loose and slippery. Not to mention, even being slightly brushed knocks you out of your attack, and that meter is gone. It's a massive gamble, especially considering an enemy might just no-sell it. Good use of heavy attacks is really important in this game to break shields, manage crowds, clear space for yourself, and if you're going for score, clear up fights expediently. I could deal with it being risky if it meant I'm risking things for a good payoff. Make it so I'm slower but I'm going to get hit. I'm already chucking away potential healing and overall damage, but the fact that the lightest enemy attack can cut it off, and now I control like a gorilla on a slip and slide, just so I might miss anyway, not a fan of it. Those are my gripes, but overall Aces Wild is a fantastic game. While these issues do become more manageable as you get better at it, it's still annoying when they rear their head. Save for that, I can't complain much. Eventually Ace fights his way to his brother, or in my case selects it from the screen because I still can't beat those rooms. If you're wondering what those rooms are, it's a boss gauntlet. You face 2 of the bosses at the same time, in sequence. Oh boy, yeah. I'm too rich for my blood. As for Rex Wilder, well, he's less of a challenge than near enough everything that came before him, which makes sense for the guy who had to buy everyone else off. It's not a noteworthy fight because he doesn't really do anything the other bosses already had done, and he generally does what they did worse. This is one of the first games I've reviewed where I've really worried about making it look easy by picking only footage from my good fights. Watching back a recording from my first few hours in, compared to much later, is pretty staggering in terms of how good you make the game look, and I found watching the game back alone to be pretty fun. I bring this up because some bosses took me 5 to 15 attempts, so I was thrown a bit by this fuck going down in 3 tries. I legitimately wondered, that's it? I won? I mean, I didn't, because I didn't beat those fucks, but, you know, still kinda counts. Then we get another paragraph-long text crawl. Luckily, we never cared about the story to begin with. Overall, I'm happy with it. Tight controls, fun enemies who are used well, mostly enjoyable boss fights, a good soundtrack, and this game is just fun to watch for me. Playing it skillfully is incredibly satisfying because it feels earned. If you enjoy brawlers and you want to see aerial enemies done well, then yeah, check out Aces Wild.